Welcome to Cut the Crop, keeping you in the know about everything you grow. Researchers, growers and other interesting folk delivering insights and information on topics ranging from agronomy to profitability. Brought to you by the Foundation for Arable Research.
Hello and welcome to Cut the Crop. My name's Alison Stewart and I'm your host for this session. And today we have FAR's Senior Cereal Researcher, Jo Drummond, with us. Welcome, Jo.
Hi, Alison.
Yeah, so today I think we're going to be talking about cultivar performance.
And picking a winner.
And picking a winner, absolutely. So what lessons have we learnt from the previous 2 seasons worth of evaluations?
So the last 2 seasons, particularly for Canterbury, have been seasons of contrast. And what that does is allows us to see what the cultivars are doing across a range of different environments and conditions. And even with the challenges of the previous harvest, we've still got some lessons that we can take away that can help us pick our winners and help us sort of sift through what's going to perform for us across the board.
So what were the 2 big sort of like major differences in weather conditions? What was the contrast that you were looking at?
So what we experienced were contrasting seasons. So in the 21-22 year, we had low solar radiation compared to our long-term means during that grain field period in conjunction with high rainfall. And that high rainfall continued all the way through to our harvest and made a really challenging harvest for us. So with those 2 big levers at play, that was sort of a double whammy in terms of not being able to achieve yield potential. In the more recent season, we had near average solar radiation. Our rainfall was about average, so we weren't in the same disease pressure environment. And that still meant that even with that, we were still able to tease out differences to pick winners.
And so what advice have you got then for the growers around, when they're deciding what cereal cultivars to use?
The first thing is to have a look at your cultivar evaluation booklets. So those evaluation booklets are going to be coming out in April. And if you stay tuned to the podcast, we'll give you a sneak peek later. But what we need to do is we need to consider where we are in New Zealand, because different cultivars are going to perform differently depending on where you are. So you can pick a winner for your region. You need to pick a winner that's going to give you plenty of plasticity in terms of when you can sow it. So some cultivars might be a little bit more specific and have more specific requirements around their sowing date window, and others might have a wide range of dates options that are available to you. So you can consider those options as well. And also we need to consider our disease ratings. So our disease ratings aren't just for our big major disease in wheat, Septoria triticide blotch. We need to look across the spectrum of diseases. And that's really important because in the last season, we had a rust dominant season in parts of New Zealand. And that means we had to change some of our management, and some of the cultivars that we thought were going to be really resilient didn't turn out to be.
Yeah. So what might we expect then from cultivars later in the season?
So again, it depends on the type of disease pressure that we have. Last year was quite rust dominant in parts of Canterbury. So that means our later fungicide programs, we may need to change our approach and have a more rust-based program. So a Septoria program generally across the board is going to give you pretty good coverage against rusts. But in this last season, we saw some particular pathotypes that appeared to render some cultivars quite sensitive where they might not have been. So that sometimes requires a change of approach. And that means we might be looking more towards a rust-focused DMI, our triazole group 3, and a strobilurin. So a strobilurin is not going to do anything against Septoria, but it's going to do a really good job against rust. So we might need to look at our later program and tweak it as we need to.
So you're going to give us a little bit of a sneak preview, I guess.
I am.
Yes, good. Okay, go for it.
Right. Well, before we do that, there's another couple of things that we also need to consider. We've talked about our disease tolerances across the board, and also looking at our disease tolerances across the board gives us flexibility. We've talked a little bit about changing our approach, and having a cultivar that's resilient gives us the ability to do that without suffering yield loss. It also gives us the opportunity, if we are in a position to, depending on the seasonal pressure, to be able to tweak our program and consider reducing our inputs if we've got a cultivar and a season that allows it. And those two contrasting seasons were really good examples of how we could implement programs that might have had a slightly lower chemical footprint to allow ourselves, to maximize that sort of sweet spot between yield and disease control and resistance management, which is really, really key.
And I like when you're talking about the lighter footprint, because that's obviously a big focus for us, trying to maintain that productivity but with a lighter footprint.
Absolutely. And having that lighter footprint also means that we can actually build resilience into our program so that we can actually continue to use the products that we need when we need them. So it's a really sort of, it's a triple-pronged attack on actually building resilience in your cultivar, building resilience into your own business in terms of having your yield potential protected by selecting a cultivar that's resilient, and also protecting your chemistry. So what we're trying to do with our programs is have that, multi-gene obstacle course where we've got lots of different factors that can be genetic and they can be strategic and cultural, things like sowing date, and pulling those all together to try and make it much, much harder for that disease to overcome our cultivars. And that's again really important because once again, we might be seeing some changes in the ratings that our cultivars have. And that happens when the pathogen pathotypes, like the pathogen soup, changes year on year. So what we can see over time is that the cultivar ratings change. That means that the cultivar itself isn't breaking down. It just means that the pathogen population is able to adapt.
And how, to what extent has that been occurring?
We've seen that pretty rapidly in some cultivars. I know particularly for Firelight was quite susceptible to some varieties of rust. So when we think back to where we were a year ago, it had a moderately resistant rating for rust. Now, depending on the pathotype of rust, we may be in a place where we may be more susceptible. That's just one example. Other examples over time, we've seen cultivars like Graham and Starfire have had changes in ratings over time. And I think back to my time at FAR, the cultivars when I started at FAR that were the most resistant are now at the bottom of the pack. So we see that change in ratings over time that corresponds to the change in the population of the pathogen.
Yeah. So that makes it really important that people check those disease ratings every year.
Oh, absolutely, because that's what's going to help us make our decision to pick a winner. So there are lots of sort of agronomic and disease rating factors that you need to consider, and having that cultivar book in front of you is going to really help with that. Before Christmas, we took the opportunity to go out and actually take some photos and film some footage of our cereal performance trials so that we could give growers an indication of what they might expect come grain fill period. So what we thought we'd do today would be to run through our Chertsey Mid-Canterbury irrigated trial for feed wheat and our irrigated milling wheat trial at Dorrie. This is Voltron. It yielded 11.28 tonnes per hectare in our CPT trial. This is a mid-season feed and biscuit wheat with high sprouting resilience. It has a profuse tillering habit and lacks a vernalisation requirement. So it means it's got a really wide sowing window, so you can sow it from late March all the way through until early August. It is susceptible to sharp eye spot and it needs a growth stage 32 spray that is going to protect it against these diseases in vulnerable conditions. This is CK130. So CK130 is in its first year in CPT trials. It is a high-yielding feed wheat with early to medium maturity. It has excellent fusarium resistance along with solid septoria and rust ratings. It yielded 11.33 tonnes per hectare in our CPT trial at Chertsey. We also run nil fungicide replicates at Chertsey, and to give you an indication of how that's performing, without fungicide, it yielded 5.8 tonnes per hectare. This is Wakanui. So Wakanui has been around for quite a while and featured prominently in our 20 by 2020 work. It is a tall variety with reasonable straw strength. However, it will need to be managed for septoria, especially in early sown crops. And it can be susceptible to stripe rust late in the season. It yielded 10.61 tonnes per hectare, and without fungicide, it yielded 7.2. This is Graham. So Graham continues to be a reliable feed wheat, and it also has biscuit properties, so it can be milled. It has intermediate resistance to septoria, but it has a really wide sowing window, so it suits April through to June sowing and has early maturity for early harvest. It does produce large heavy grain and has a low sprouting risk. It yielded 10.58 tonnes, and without fungicide it yielded 7.4 tonnes per hectare. Next up is Whopper. So Whopper is a dual purpose wheat. It fits both as a feed and as a medium quality milling wheat. It is a true early season variety, and it has late maturity and medium to tall height with good straw strength. It has good resistance to septoria and stripe rust, but it does need a little bit of protection from leaf rust, so consider that when thinking of your programs. It yielded 11.94 tonnes per hectare with irrigation with fungicide and 6.3 tonnes per hectare without. CRWT233 is a new coded line. It's a hard feed wheat with good yield potential. It has good grain characteristics. It can get some septoria, but is relatively tolerant for leaf rust. It's a taller than average variety, so consider that when thinking about your plant growth regulator programs. It yielded 11.59 tonnes with fungicide and 9 tonnes without. This is CK25. This is a new variety, first year in CPT2 trials this year. It's a high-yielding biscuit wheat with excellent all-round disease resistance, stiff straw and medium maturity. It yielded 11.11 tonnes with fungicide and 10.9 tonnes per hectare without. CRWT267, it's in its second year in CPT, and the heads can appear slightly clubbed at the end of the season if high plant growth regulators are applied. It gets a little bit of septoria, but it's generally sound for most diseases with good straw strength. It yielded 11.87 tonnes per hectare with fungicide, and without, it yielded 10.2. This is Reflection. So it's a moderate to high yielding feed wheat. It has excellent resistance to septoria, triticide blotch, and leaf rust. It's slow developing with an early finish, so it's suitable for sowing from March through to about May. It's got a short, stiff straw and has an erect plant with moderate tillering, so it does sometimes like quite high plant populations to maximise yield. It yielded 10.91 tonnes with fungicide and 10.3 tonnes without. SY Springboard is a high-yielding feed wheat with bred pedigree and potential. It is early maturing and it has a moderate disease package. It yielded 11.707 tonnes with fungicide and 7.2 tonnes per hectare without. Starfire has been in CPT trials for a number of years. It is a high-yielding wheat, but it does need a lot of love in the fungicide department. It is tolerant to stripe rust, but it's susceptible to powdery mildew, septoria, and leaf rust. It yielded 10.58 tonnes per hectare with fungicide and 5.5 tonnes per hectare without. Ignite is a soft feed and biscuit wheat with high septoria and stripe rust resistance. It's got moderate resistance to mildew and leaf rust. It does have a minor vernalization requirement, giving it a wide sowing window from April through to about August. It's a compact plant type with short, stiff straw. It yielded 10.16 tonnes per hectare with fungicide, and without fungicide, 6.3 tonnes per hectare. So have a look at these trials and consider what the difference between the fungicide treated and the nil fungicide treated to help you make your decision. This is Kieran. Kieran is a high-yielding hard feed wheat. It has intermediate tolerance for septoria and yellow rust, and it is quite consistent over different soil types. It yielded 10.85 tonnes per hectare with fungicide, and without 6.3 tonnes per hectare. This is Firelight. Now, Firelight was subject to this pathotype of rust that it appeared to be particularly susceptible to. Traditionally, this has been a tolerant variety to a number of diseases, but we do need to be very careful now in terms of managing it from the rust space. So with a fungicide program, 11.43 tonnes per hectare, and in the very rust-driven season that we saw previously, without fungicide, 5 tonnes per hectare was all it achieved without fungicide. This is another new variety in its first year in CPT trials. This is a UK-bred hard winter feed wheat. It's consistently been in top yielding lines in CPT1 trials, and it has shown reasonable disease tolerance to date. It's with fungicide yielded 11.8 tonnes per hectare, and without 10.9. And finally, another new entry into CPT2 this season, SY119179. So this is a coded line and will eventually have a name. It's a high-yielding, medium maturity, medium height feed wheat. It actually has reflection that we saw earlier as a cross. So it has some nice septoria resistance and is a little bit more stable in terms of its yield. It yielded 10.85 tonnes per hectare with fungicide and without 10.5. So that summarises our CPT feed wheat at Chertsey with irrigation. Our next trial to run through is our milling wheat at Dorrie in Mid-Canterbury, also with irrigation. First up, we have CRWT 247. So this is a premium milling wheat with strong to medium dough properties and good water absorption. It has good disease resistance to all diseases except it is moderately susceptible to leaf rust. It has medium maturity and an erect flag leaf. Now this trial doesn't have a nil disease replicate, but with fungicide it achieved 12 tonnes per hectare. Whopper that we saw in our irrigated feed wheat trial, we talked about how Whopper is a dual purpose wheat, so it has both feed qualities and fits in that medium milling category. Premium 2, so that medium category, it's true winter, it's got reasonable tolerance for septoria, but does need that protection from leaf rust. It performs well in both dryland and irrigated sites, and at this site, yielded 14.1 tonnes per hectare. This is Griffin. So Griffin is a premium grade milling wheat. It has very strong balanced dough properties with good ostensibility and medium water absorption. With an autumn sowing, its heading date is around 10 days later than Reliance. It does tend to be susceptible to mildew and is moderately susceptible towards leaf rust, which may need some attention during the season, and it yielded 13.23 tonnes per hectare. Discovery is a medium grade milling wheat. It's consistently high yielding, it's tall with stiff straw and has a really strong response to plant growth regulators. It does tend to be moderately susceptible to septoria and it can be susceptible to stripe rust early in its growth stages, but once it gets older it does tend to be a little bit more tolerant. It yielded 12.85 tonnes per hectare. This is Duchess. Duchess is a premium grade milling wheat with strong balanced dough properties and it typically yields about 5 to 10% above Conquest. It can be sown from late April through to late August. It is awnless and has good sprouting resistance and a medium straw length, although it is moderately susceptible to leaf rust. It yielded 12.51 tonnes per hectare. This is another coded line, SY115666. This is a medium grade milling wheat. It's waxless and has medium to high yields. It is reasonable rust tolerance and septoria resistance. And this was its first year in CPT trials this year, and it achieved 12.09 tonnes per hectare. This is Catherine. This is another medium grade milling wheat. It has medium dough properties with good water absorption and bake scores. It can be very high yielding, but it can be susceptible to some diseases, particularly septoria and leaf rust. It yielded 13.36 tonnes per hectare. This is Conquest. This is a premium grade milling wheat and has very strong, well-balanced dough properties. It has a sowing window from late April through to about September. It does tend to be a little bit susceptible to new races of leaf rust, so this will need to be managed carefully, and it is also moderately susceptible to mildew, and it yielded 11.8 tonnes per hectare. Viceroy is another medium grade milling wheat. It's moderately susceptible to septoria, leaf rust and mildew, and it performs quite well in harsh conditions with good yields and good grain size. It has moderately high sprouting resistance and is typically sown from May through to about August and yielded 12.09 tonnes per hectare. This is Hanson. Hanson is a gristing wheat. It's able to be sown from May through to late August and has good resistance to most diseases including septoria. It's medium to tall, so responds well to plant growth regulator when high yields are expected, and it achieved 12.51 tonnes per hectare. RGT Skyfall is also a gristing wheat. It is early to intermediate maturing and has a short plant height. It shows good disease resistance, although some powdery mildew symptoms can be expected, and it may need higher nitrogen inputs for high yields and protein quality. It yielded 13.09 12.12 tonnes per hectare. This is Reliance. So Reliance is a premium grade milling wheat. It has strong and balanced dough properties with a sowing window from May through to September. It's moderately susceptible to mildew, and that may need to be taken into consideration. And it also has quite good resistance to things like Fusarium head scab. It yielded 12.34 tonnes per hectare. Zayat is a medium grade milling wheat. It has wide milling options and good disease resistance with medium maturity and yielded 13.63 tonnes per hectare. And finally, CRWT 263. This is a medium grade milling wheat with medium grade dough properties. It has good leaf rust resistance and moderate resistance to septoria. It's got a medium height with stiff straw and yielded 12.41 tonnes per hectare. That concludes our whistle stop CPT tour that we took before Christmas.
Excellent. Hey, I have to say, I was quite surprised at the difference between some cultivars in the difference between fungicide and nil fungicide.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a really, really important consideration. And when we talk about cultivars giving you resilience in terms of maintaining and protecting your yield potential and giving you wiggle room as to the type of fungicide program you can apply, that's exactly what we're talking about. So for some of those varieties, we're seeing a yield response of less than a tonne. So I think for the highest performing nil fungicide treated, I think it was about 600 kilos. And that gives you plenty of scope to play around with your fungicide program and make choices that enable you to protect the cultivar and protect your chemistry. On the other side, some had yield responses of maybe up to 6 tonnes, which is a massive difference. And that can show you how different cultivars need different programs in different seasons with different disease pressures.
Yes, and not straightforward.
Not straightforward. Yeah. But pay attention to the cultivar books when they come out, and also have a look at our cereal disease management strategy, because within that document, there are lots of options that allow you to manage and tweak and understand the dynamics between your fungicide program and your cultivar and how best to manage those to get the best of both worlds.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Jo.
Thank you, Alison.
Great. And thank you, listeners. Have a safe day on the farm.
Thanks for tuning in to Cut the Crop, presented to you by FAR. If you'd like to know more about any of the topics discussed or have any suggestions for future topics, go to www.cutthecrop.co.nz.